Have you ever heard someone talk about an issue that sounded awfully like a conspiracy theory you've heard about? Well, I'd like to take a look at a video that piqued my interest. A video published by an alternative institution of higher education, one that's not like the other colleges, as in, it's just not an institution of higher education. Today I'll be looking at a video by none other than PragerU, hosted by Dinesh D'Souza. Now don't get me wrong, with over 1.6 million views, you'd think that they'd know a thing or two, and being an alternative university, you'd think they'd have pretty credible sources for their claims. So let's take a dive into their analysis of something every American is taught to fear. But let me make a quick disclaimer first. I will be going over some issues regarding socialism and conspiracy theories. Remember that conspiracy theories are just that, conspiracies. This video is not an attempt to convert you, the audience, up, down, left, or right on the political compass. This video is an attempt to clarify misinformation propagated by PragerU and how they disguise conspiracy theories with American patriotism. If you haven't already seen the full video by PragerU, I highly encourage you to go watch it to make sure I'm not misrepresenting their points. I'll include a link to their video in the description below. Now let's jump right into it.
There's a new socialism in town. I call it Identity Socialism.
Okay, right off the bat, D'Souza says that he himself dubs this new socialism in town as Identity Socialism. After a brief Google search, we can see that the search results with the term Identity Socialism all link to sites either quoting D'Souza or sites that are right-wing or Christian in nature. Not surprising, Identity Socialism is just a made-up term used to associate something he considers to be bad with the label of socialism.
The old socialism, the kind Karl Marx dreamed up, was all about the working class, the sort of blue-collar worker who, ironically, voted for President Trump. But today's socialists couldn't care less about the guy in the hard hat. He had his chance at revolution and blew it. Today's socialist is all about race, gender, and transgender rights. Class is an afterthought.
Okay, so he brings up old socialism, the kind Karl Marx dreamed up. Let's just set the record straight for a moment. Socialism as a political, social, and economic philosophy did not originate from Karl Marx. Socialism as an economic ideology has existed for a long time, an early example being the Mauryan Empire in India way back in the 3rd century BCE. The teachings of Jesus Christ, for example, are frequently described as being socialist in nature. More importantly, the first self-conscious socialist movements arose in the 1820s and 30s by followers of Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, and Henri Saint-Simon. Marx's belief system is collectively known and understood as Marxism, which holds that human societies develop through class conflict. Now, you might know him for a different ideology, one that the United States has painted as a boogeyman: communism. The idea of a communist, or more specifically, a classless and egalitarian society, dates back to ancient Greece and is more prominently described in the 5th century Mazdak movement in Persia, that challenged the noble class and organized religion, criticized the institution of private property, and sought to create a society where all people are socially equal. Key word there being socially equal. In short, Karl Marx didn't invent the concepts of socialism or communism, but he did invent the concept of Marxism. Next, he brings up the working class and how they ironically voted for President Donald Trump. What he's saying, though, isn't completely correct. In the 2020 election, there were 3% more male college graduates, 27% more female non-college graduates, and 42% more male non-college graduates who voted for Trump over current US President Biden. Okay, let's pause for a moment. Let me make something very clear. I'm not saying that all non-college grads are blue-collar workers, or that all blue-collar workers are non-college grads. When it comes to the data collected regarding voter statistics, you can't really choose what they include as demographics. Blue and white-collar workers are two demographics that typically aren't reported on, and so, as a result, neither Dinesh nor I can make definitive claims about who blue-collar workers vote for. The best we can do is look through the data collected and make educated assumptions. Out of the sources I found, the following demographics we can look at are listed below. If you want to review all the results, the links to my sources will be in the end credits. It's a pretty big and comprehensive list, so it's definitely worth a look. When it comes to career-related choices, the categories are annual income, university or community college status, military service, union membership, and full versus part-time employment. Unfortunately, post-secondary options like trade and vocational school are excluded from this list, which places these people into the non-college grad category. If you ask me, I think this is unfair, especially considering that many blue-collar workers pursue trade/vocational schooling. As for my assumptions, blue-collar workers tend to perform manual labor such as construction, mining, maintenance, agriculture, and manufacturing. They tend to also typically require specific on-site training, apprenticeships, or vocational school instead of attending university. However, specialized jobs can require higher levels of education/experience. Blue-collar workers are also more likely to be paid hourly with a specific work time schedule. They on average earn less income per year when compared to white-collar workers and are much more likely to be in a union. Here's a list of 8 broad career choices for both groups and their average annual incomes. Please take a moment to pause if you'd like to read through it. So for the sake of transparency and so we can move on, here are the assumptions I'm making. Thank you for bearing with me through this lengthy clarification. So to get back on track, why do blue-collar workers, according to D'Souza, vote red? Well, to start, many don't. Out of 3,520 respondents, 54% of voters who earned less than $30,000, 56% of voters who earned between $30,000 and $50,000, and 57% of voters who earned between $50,000 and $100,000 voted for Biden. On the other hand, 58% of voters who earned between $100,000 and $200,000 voted for Trump. So here's the disparity. Out of 15,095 respondents, white college grads, non-white college grads, and non-white non-college grads voted 51%, 70%, and 72% respectively for Biden. I think D'Souza is talking about the 67% of white non-college grads who voted for Trump. Combined, 54% of voters who never attended college did vote for Trump. When it comes to employment type, 47% of voters who work full-time voted blue, as did 57% of voters who work part-time. Out of voters with union memberships, 56% voted blue, while those who were not in a union voted nearly 50-50. Lastly, as for military service, 44% of voters who currently or have served voted blue, as did 51% of voters who haven't. Now let's take a look at our table. I don't know how D'Souza claims that most blue-collar workers vote red, especially when the data on our assumptions comes out mostly blue. Again, this is the best I can do without having specific data on blue/white-collar work. Assumptions are just to help us extrapolate, and so based on what we have, I believe that it is more honest to say more blue-collar workers voted for Biden, and on the contrary, it's likely more white-collar workers voted for Trump instead. While many working-class Americans did vote for Biden, many also voted for Trump, but their class didn't play as much of a role in their decision as did their race and religious affiliation. 60% of non-Catholic Christians voted for Trump, with 72% of those being white non-Catholic Christians. 76% of white evangelical Christians voted red, this being the biggest indicator of who was likely to be a Trump voter. In short, what I think D'Souza meant to say was that white Christian white-collar workers voted for Trump, which I mean, isn't that ironic? D'Souza says today's socialism is all about race, gender, and transgender rights instead of class, but that's just inaccurate. D'Souza mixes up socialism, communism, and liberalism. Socialism can be best described as to pertaining to the distribution of power, whereas communism pertains more to the distribution of wealth. You know, the whole people owning the means of production phrase you've probably heard. Liberalism, though, encompasses a desire for democracy, limited government, and freedom, while still promoting capitalism, deregulation, and free markets. Think Democrats. When it comes to the distribution of power within a society, you have two ends of the spectrum. You have socialism on the left half and fascism on the right half. As you move from left to right, the amount of people who hold power decreases. It goes from being a democracy to an oligarchy and then to an autocracy. There are different branches of socialism that I'll briefly go over. Economic socialism is characterized by the social ownership of the means of production. Democratic socialism is characterized by the use and support of economic and social interventions to promote social justice. Political socialism stems from ideas coined in the latter half of the 18th century due to concerns about the social problems that came with capitalism. In fact, only in the late 1800s did socialist ideas come to symbolize an opposition to capitalism based on the social ownership of the means of production. Libertarian socialism rejects the concept of the state retaining centralized control of the economy, it emphasizes workers' rights, and supports decentralized structures of political organization. This is in sharp contrast with Bolshevism, a Marxist ideology associated with a rigid centralized government and whose goal is to establish the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat. Class isn't an afterthought, but socialism still maintains a strong focus on social equality for all people, and that includes people of all races and genders. Now back to Mr. D'Souza.
To understand this is to understand the left's takeover of the college campus and all the ills that takeover has spawned, from Me Too to Black Lives Matter to girls competing against biological boys. But campus culture has now metastasized into the culture of the whole society. As liberal writer Andrew Sullivan has put it, we all live on campus now.
So, the argument of the left taking over college campuses is really boggling to me. First of all, he again conflates neoliberalism with leftism, the two being very different from each other. And like we saw before, the majority of college grads voted for Biden in the 2020 election, but it is very disingenuous to equate being a Democrat with being a leftist or a socialist. It is very telling that D'Souza considers Me Too, BLM, and transgender equality to be societal ills. These are organizations and ideologies that focus on marginalized groups who are often the recipients of state-sanctioned violence. Also, it kind of sounds like D'Souza believes that higher education is a tool used to subvert the youth into becoming socialists. Sounds kind of familiar.
Identity socialism is first and foremost about division, not just class division, but now race division, gender division, transgender division. Blacks and Latinos are in, whites are out, women are in, men are out. Gays, bisexuals, transsexuals, transgenders are in, heterosexuals are out, illegals are in, native-born citizens are out. One may think this is all part of the politics of inclusion, but to think that is to get only half the picture. The point for the left is not merely to include, but also to exclude.
Who is the left excluding here? You mean cisgendered, heterosexual, white Christian men, right? Well, they still deserve to be included, but maybe they should make more room for others who are not a part of that tiny circle when it comes to making policies that affect those same people. When it comes to socialism as a whole, the focus is on removing divisive barriers and giving more socioeconomic power and opportunities to the working class, i.e., a democracy. There is a focus on race and gender division, but it's on equating whites and non-whites and not only men and women, but people of all genders. Also, why does D'Souza specifically separate transgender people from cisgender people and compare it to heterosexuality? Believe it or not, you can be transgender and heterosexual at the same time. Gender identity is separate from sexual orientation. And last but not least, when you say native-born citizens, do you exclusively mean citizens born on U.S. soil, or are you also including people like Ted Cruz, who were born outside the U.S. but are naturalized citizens because one of their parents was already a U.S. citizen? Just a thought.
So where did this identity socialism come from? Meet Herbert Marcuse.
Oh, shit. Here we go again.
Remember when I asked that conspiracy question? Well, you may have heard this one before.
Born in Berlin in 1898, Marcuse fled Germany at the dawn of the Nazi era. After stints at Columbia, Harvard, and Brandeis, Marcuse moved to California, where he joined the University of California at San Diego in 1965. You'd think that living in a paradise like Southern California, with all the comforts and privileges of academic life, might have softened Marcuse's Marx-like hatred of capitalism. But it was not to be. If anything, the more he prospered, the more he wanted to bring the system down.
Okay, let's talk about Herbert Marcuse for a quick second. Marcuse was born in 1898 in Berlin, Germany. In 1933, the rise of the Third Reich made his academic career slow to a halt. He then joined the Institute for Social Research, more commonly known as the Frankfurt School. If you know about the Frankfurt School, then chances are you've probably heard some conspiracies about it. During this time, he published his review of economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, in which he revises the interpretation of Marxism, but through the lens of Marx's early work. He then went into exile with the Frankfurt School to Geneva, and then afterwards to the good old US of A in 1934, eventually earning his US citizenship in 1940. It's really problematic that D'Souza brings up Marcuse specifically, but neglects to mention his involvement with the Frankfurt School, especially when talking about what he considers to be identity socialism, and we'll see why in a bit.
He had a problem, however, a big one. Socialism didn't work in America. Life was too good. The working class in the U.S. didn't aspire to overthrow the existing order. They aspired to own a home. How could you foment revolution without revolutionaries? Classic Marxism had no answer for this.
There's a lot to unpack there. He mentions how socialism didn't work in the US in the 60s, but that's not entirely accurate. After the Second World War, pro-business conservatives gained power in Congress and passed the Taft-Hartley Act. This severely hindered labor unions and enabled businesses to crack down on union strikes under the guise of it serving as a potential national security risk. However, through the 50s, unionization increased, and in the 60s, public sector unions helped secure good wages, high pensions, and safer working conditions for workers, something PragerU has not been a huge fan of. Maybe it's because their donors are large-scale corporations that consistently oppose regulations that address underemployment, or maybe it's Maybelline.
But almost 100 years after Marx, Marcuse did. The answer was college students. They would be the recruits for what he termed the Great Refusal, the repudiation and overthrow of free market capitalism.
D'Souza claims that college students are next in line to be subverted by identity socialism. So let's take a good look at this great refusal D'Souza talks about. The phrase originates from Dante's Inferno, but Alfred Whitehead later used the phrase, the great refusal, to underline how we might not resign ourselves to the acceptance of things as they are. In other words, Whitehead's use of the phrase great refusal was to encourage others to not accept the status quo solely on the grounds that it's always been this way, so why change it? Instead, others are meant to favor ideologies that promote an ideal society. Marcuse co-opted Whitehead's interpretation to better integrate the working class and capitalist stabilization. He called for a refusal of waste and restriction of productivity, the need for aggressive expansion, the constant threat of war, intensified exploitation, and the dehumanization of others. Granted, I do want to clarify that yes, D'Souza is correct when he mentions Marcuse's desire to overthrow capitalism. Marcuse wanted total revolution, as in a radical upheaval and overthrow of the previously existing order, bringing about wide-ranging changes that would eliminate capitalism and establish revolutionary socialism.
Conditions were perfect. The students of the 60s were already living in what was in effect a socialist commune, a university campus. Rather than being grateful to their parents for providing them with this opportunity to learn and study, they were restless and bored. Most importantly, they were looking for meaning, a form of self-fulfillment that went beyond material gratification.
So this is a tad confusing. Is D'Souza suggesting that looking for a form of self-fulfillment that goes beyond material gratification a bad thing? Like the whole pursuit of happiness thing? Because that's like as American as it gets. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time PragerU masqueraded as patriotic Americans. As for college campuses being socialist communes, what? Is it because some students live together in dorms? Or maybe it's the enforced student meal plans, or the ridiculously high tuition, room and board rates? Or is it because they're receiving an education, perhaps one you might not like, Mr. D'Souza?
Of course, as with all successful social movements, timing was critical. Here, Marcuse was very fortunate. The 60s was the decade of the Vietnam War. Students faced the prospect of being drafted. Thus, they had selfish reasons to oppose the conflict. Marcuse and his acolytes turned this selfishness into righteousness by teaching the students that they weren't draft dodgers, they were noble resistors who were part of a global struggle for social justice.
This is a little much. Students were selfish for not wanting to be drafted to Vietnam? There were many reasons to oppose the war in Vietnam, Allied imperialism being the biggest, but I won't get into the details of the Vietnam War because that's beyond the scope of this video. What's problematic is D'Souza and others on the right glorifying the war, not the students who opposed it.
Marcuse portrayed Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong as a kind of third world proletariat, fighting to free themselves from American imperialism. This represented a transposition of Marxist categories. The new working class were the Vietnamese freedom fighters. The evil capitalists were American soldiers serving on behalf of the American government.
What's odd here is that D'Souza's right. Vietnam was more accurately a second world country, but I think what D'Souza meant to say was developing country. The Viet Cong were literally a second world proletariat fighting to free themselves from American and French imperialism. The new working class were the Vietnamese and the, to quote D'Souza, evil capitalists were American soldiers. This is an extremely disingenuous comparison because he's implying that the left views American soldiers in Vietnam as the evil capitalists. But that's not true. The evildoers, for lack of a better word, were those who drafted young men to war via coercion, and the capitalists were the business owners who profited from the United States' military-industrial complex. And this was all done at the expense of American lives overseas.
Marcuse found, in addition to the students, other groups ripe for the taking. The first was the Black Power movement, which was a militant adjunct to the civil rights movement. The beauty of this group, from Marcuse's point of view, was that unlike white students, its members wouldn't have to be instructed in the art of grievance. Blacks had grievances that dated back centuries. Through another Marxist transposition, blacks would become the working class, whites the capitalist class. Race, in this analysis, took the place of class.
What D'Souza is saying is mostly incorrect, but with some truth peppered throughout. How he frames black people in the United States at the time is what's really problematic, though. He starts with the Black Power movement and describes them as a militant adjunct to the civil rights movement. Let's take a closer look at his choice of vocabulary. The Black Power movement, first and foremost, was a social movement aimed at establishing safety and self-sufficiency for Black Americans, who didn't as a result of racial segregation in the 1960s. By the late 1960s, the BPM shifted from nonviolence to more immediate violent action in order to oppose white supremacy within the United States. To from the get-go label the BPM as a militant group is dishonest, and more context needs to be given before making such a claim. But even more dishonest is his use of the following word, adjunct. D'Souza here is using adjunct as a noun, whose definition is a thing added to something else as a supplementary rather than an essential part. To suggest that the BPM was merely supplementary to the civil rights movement and not essential is just flat out wrong. What he's suggesting via his choice of words is that the BPM was only a militant organization that was insignificant within the civil rights movement. This is the first instance in which D'Souza frames minorities in America as agitators, people who are disturbing the good old American way of life.
Another emerging source of disgruntlement was the feminists. Marcuse recognized they too could be taught to see themselves as an oppressed class. This, of course, would require a further Marxist transposition. Women would now be viewed as the working class and men the capitalist class. The class category would now be shifted to gender.
The class category wasn't shifted to gender. Women in the US have been a historically oppressed demographic and are a separate demographic from class. You can be both a woman and a laborer within the working class and still be discriminated against in different ways. The reason D'Souza frames race and gender as a so-called Marxist transposition is so he can belittle them using the American distaste of socialism and communism, just as he did with Black Americans previously. By framing BPM and feminism as a Marxist transposition, D'Souza is trying to make them out to be the enemy, partners of the evil socialists trying to subvert American culture. If you think this sounds familiar, it's because this isn't some new theory created by D'Souza. It's been around since the 90s.
Marcuse recognized that educating and mobilizing all these groups, the bored students, the aggrieved blacks, and the angry feminists, would take time. But he wasn't in a hurry. Soon enough, the radical students would be the radical professors, teaching identity socialism to a fresh crop of impressionable recruits.
What D'Souza labels as identity socialism is a 30-year-old conspiracy theory that you've probably heard of before, cultural Marxism. This conspiracy claims that the Jewish Marxists of the Frankfurt School implemented a slow takeover of culture, seeking to undermine Christianity, family, and nation in favor of a new worldview and system of control involving mass immigration, sexual liberation, and moral and aesthetic decline. The three main groups who promote this conspiracy theory are right-wing politicians, fundamentalist Christians, and white supremacists. You might know this conspiracy by another name. The 1776 report goes over it in their section titled Identity Politics. Again, just to clarify, identity politics and cultural Marxism are two very different things. I'm just stating that the 1776 report describes cultural Marxism's supposed effects in the United States and puts it under the label of identity politics. The 1776 report likens this to things like communism, criticizes feminist movements, and states that universities are hotbeds of anti-Americanism. Pretty similar to what we just heard D'Souza describe. This is also very similar to the anti-Semitic propaganda distributed by the Nazis called cultural Bolshevism. Cultural Marxist conspiracists claim that everything from race equality, feminism, sexual liberation, gay rights, multiculturalism, affirmative action, the corruption of higher education, and for some reason, environmentalism, are the result of insidious members of the Institute of Social Research who migrated to America. Now, before the gotchas roll in from people saying, that's BS, Dennis Prager is Jewish, how could PragerU support an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, huh? Well, good question. Dennis Prager is a big promoter of the greatness of Western capitalism, nationalism, and imperialism. Dennis Prager has also been a major advocate for Western/Judeo-Christian values. A big part of cultural Marxism is the belief that some foreign power is attempting to subvert these values that, again, PragerU stands for and promotes. Not all versions of this conspiracy emphasize its anti-Semitism, but they still all rely on anti-Semitic tropes. This is most clearly seen with the Nazis and their belief of Judeo-Bolshevism, another conspiracy theory in which Jewish bankers were responsible for the spreading of Bolshevism, or, more recognizably, socialism/communism. Dennis Prager is very much a supporter of capitalism and nationalism, which rival communism and socialism, hence why PragerU promotes cultural Marxism, but always neglects to mention its anti-Semitic history. When confronted, it's very easy to replace the Jews with the communists or the socialists or the left. When he brings up Judeo-Christian values, it's just an attempt to erase the anti-Semitic component of cultural Marxism for his viewers. Chances are, most people watching PragerU videos don't know the complicated history of the Frankfurt School or the conspiracies fabricated about them 80 years ago. It's why they use the word Marxism over Bolshevism, and why they still emphasize on how people of color, women, and the LGBTQ community are stirring the pot. PragerU cleverly packages these beliefs to radicalize their base, with most of them not understanding where or when these conspiracies originated from. D'Souza never brought up Judaism because he didn't need to. He just replaced the term Jewish with socialist, like in Identity Socialism. D'Souza is simply framing minorities as the antagonistic socialists who want to bring down American/Christian/Western values. It's the same racist, misogynistic, homophobic, and xenophobic ideas, but neatly packaged for the 21st century conservative. So let's wrap this up real quick.
Over time, Marcuse believed the university could produce a new type of culture, and that culture would then spill into the larger society to infect primary education, the news media, and entertainment. Even big business, the hated capitalist class itself, would succumb.
Remember that part about corrupting higher education and society?
He was right. Identity socialism has arrived. I'm Dinesh D'Souza for Prager University.
And with that marks the end of PragerU's commentary on cultural Marxism. The important takeaway from this is that PragerU makes videos discussing old right-wing nationalist propaganda, but cleaned up in a way that it can be presented to a modern audience. Cultural Marxism certainly isn't new, but when repackaged as Identity Socialism, it seems like this new tactic that leftists are using to subvert Western culture. When you have right-wing groups like the President's Advisory 1776 Commission demonizing what they consider to be identity politics, and many Americans in the political sphere discussing/embracing socialist policies, the term identity socialism hits the nail right on the head. Today's discourse mentions these two words a lot, and when you hear them together, you wouldn't immediately think that it was some far-right ultra-nationalist and anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. PragerU's accessibility to a wide audience, combined with its disdain for higher education and appeal to American patriotism, is what makes it dangerous. And for the record, I'm not calling Dinesh D'Souza or Dennis Prager a Nazi, as that would be reductive and pointless, but they sure do seem to like their conspiracies. And that's my take on PragerU's identity socialism, or more accurately, the cultural Marxist conspiracy theory. I wanted to make a more casual video that still addresses misinformation on the internet, while specifically pointing out the issues that I have with PragerU and their influence over such a large audience. What is your take on D'Souza's message? Has identity socialism really arrived? Do you identify as a nationalist? Why do you love capitalism? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments down below. If you learned something today or just enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, or
Please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
Thank you to Dinesh D'Souza and PragerU for the source material, and thank you all for watching today.